People in Boston have been contending with inequality in public schools since at least the 18th century. The desegregation order by the federal court in the 1970s is well known, but there's also a long story of community struggle and initiative, including the voluntary desegregation program between city and suburbs called METCO. That history was recently pieced together in a virtual tour produced by METCO students. To tell us about the effort is METCO's Director of Communications, Outreach, and Engagement, Colin Stokes. Thank you very much for being with us, Colin.
Great to be here, Chris.
When I said virtual tour, I can imagine viewers saying, oh, this is another pandemic thing, but actually people were putting together ideas for this last fall. So what was the reason for that?
Well, it was supposed to be quite a literal tour. The idea was that students who live in Boston but attend schools in the suburbs are in a unique opportunity to teach their classmates about the history of the city. And the idea was for them to do this research and then bring their classmates and their teachers from the suburbs into the city and do a walking tour and really explore the neighborhoods and the history and where key moments of the civil rights movement and desegregation took place. And it was going to be really experiential. Obviously, that wasn't possible once we came time to the spring to actually deliver the tour. So we went online.
I'm trying to put my mind in yours into the heads of current students who are growing up right now. I imagine some of them have some inkling of what the achievement gap means when we use that term, but what was new to them about the story, especially if you rewind to the early or middle 1960s?
I think, well, getting to talk to the 8 high school students that we ended up hiring as part of this internship was incredibly enlightening, because the things that they were most surprised by are the things that, at least to me as an adult, I forget how shocking they really are. The level of entrenched segregation and entrenched inequality and the kind of explicit policies that have been in place for so long, things like redlining, how funding is distributed across schools, they were shocked and angry, honestly, to learn about so many of these things, and were empowered, I think, to have the chance to share that information with the broader world and remind us who maybe feel like, hey, it's always been this way, that it really isn't acceptable and that it's time to uproot some of these systems.
I've been around Boston long enough to know that we had segregated neighborhoods in the 1960s, but what I had to learn from history books was that Black children who lived in those neighborhoods, they sometimes couldn't go to schools very close to them where there would have been less segregation. They were forced to go farther away to be in a segregated school. What was it like for young people to read about something like that?
Well, particularly for METCO students, they saw themselves in these stories. They have often since kindergarten understood that they were going out of their way, taking long bus rides in the morning in order to get an education that that was powerful and resourceful and effective and exciting. And there was always that kind of unanswered and unasked question: why do I have to do this, and why do so many of my friends not? And the answers to those questions are in the history, just waiting to be discovered.
Because one of the things that they learned here was about the genesis of METCO, but even before we get to that phase, there was another history. There were parent activists who were trying to get recognition for segregation, and later on with Operation Exodus. What was the most important thing for students when they looked at the leaders who were involved in that?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that struck me as I watched them go through archives and really discover the research is that the characters are not necessarily the ones that we have been, I don't know if we've been taught to focus on them or we're used to focusing on them, but people like the governors and the judges are obviously key decision makers at key points. But it's folks like Ruth Batson and Paul Atkins and Noel Day and Ellen Jackson, who were getting up every morning for years before the governors and the mayors and the judges were making their decisions, to really push for these changes, to envision what needed to happen, to call out the public and the elected officials to say, this is what's happening and it's not acceptable. And it's those figures that play a big part in their ultimate presentation.
And talk about Ruth Batson. She was not a professional educator, but she was definitely a concerned parent, and I guess a very gutsy person.
I have come to really admire her as one of my great heroes, and certainly as somebody who works at METCO, she's clearly the godmother of METCO, and of so many other things about Boston that we now take for granted. And I one day want to see her honored with lots of statues. She had this famous, well, it's famous to me, and it should be more famous, opportunity to stand in front of the school committee in 1963 for a marathon presentation listing 14 demands that the NAACP had put together that read like the same things that we're asking for today, sadly, in protests and rallies. Things like diverse teachers and a curriculum that reflects the full student body's cultures, discipline policies that are fair, training for teachers to understand broader cultures. All these things were things that Ruth Batson and the NAACP and many others were telling the Boston School Committee, which was then elected, this needs to change. And the confrontation, the just outright hostility that she encountered from the school committee and from other elected officials would have intimidated me and would have intimidated many. And to hear and read and look at the real programs and scripts and things that Ruth Batson used, which are in the collections of our amazing libraries around the city, really brings to life for me and for the students that it's doable, that this kind of bravery and kind of toughness is not lost in the past of the 1700s when, you know, Paul Revere took his ride, but is really just a generation ago. And even here today, very tangible, and the type of thing that these young people immediately understood was something they could inherit and was their legacy and their entitlement.
Well, having worked with these students, do you see them as having been changed by this project in some way?
I do. I mean, anybody who works with young people always looks for these moments, and I feel so lucky to have gotten to witness the growth of students who, uh, you know, as you know, being a METCO student is a unique challenge, straddling two worlds, figuring out how you can fit in when you're often seen as other or different. And that was a part of what the students thought about and connected to with the history. And so to see them discover that, you know, that being in this program was an offshoot of this civil rights movement, that it was created around the same time as Operation Exodus and during this fight to desegregate the Boston schools. And it was an instance of really radical thinking between the Boston activists and suburban activists and government leaders. And they could incorporate that history into a sense of themselves as being real change agents in their schools and in their districts. And when the pandemic hit, and then followed by this resurgence of Black Lives Matter and this real intensity and revisitation of the chronic racial inequities, I was so not surprised at all, but proud and amazed at the number of these students who turned around and became the leaders at their schools that many of them had hesitated to be. That they took this knowledge and said, you know what, I understand and how these forces operate, and a number of them led school-wide discussions, participated in protests, helped their principals and their superintendents draft new ideas, convened their fellow students of color to create focus groups and understandings to really help the districts understand what needed to be done. And I think that's a great example of how history and learning about history in a way that is truly inclusive can create the kind of growth and learning that you just don't get by learning facts and and dates and figures of some far off place.
Well, this isn't just about growing into leaders and learning about history. This is about telling the story, sharing it with other people. So if people want to take advantage of that by finding their work on YouTube, what's the best way for them to track that down?
Absolutely. Well, the program is called BEAT, BEAT, which stands for Boston Education Activism Tour. So all you've got to do is go to metcoinc.org/beat, BEAT, and you'll be able to see the video product that they created, which you'll have to use your imagination to imagine that it's a walking tour with the young people. But I think they've done a pretty amazing job bringing it to life online.